Today, we're going to have a guest speaker. Please welcome Michael England, the Assistant State Soil Scientist with NRCS. So Mike has been with NRCS for over 15 years, and during his time there, he's done soil mapping details in 17 states, which have included projects with the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Department of Defense. Before joining NRCS, he received a degree in soil science from UW-Stevens Point, like probably a few of you in the group here, and served in the Marine Corps. So with his years of experience working on soil surveys, I'm very excited to hear what he has to share with us today. Thank you, Mike, so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you, Katie, for having me. All right, I guess we'll get going right into with the PowerPoint. I'll share my desktop here. And one of the topics that we'll be talking about, maybe some of you have seen part of this. I did an abbreviated version for the Wisconsin Biosolid Symposium earlier this spring. This is a little lengthier version. So I go into a little more detail on some map unit and a little bit more of the history, and we'll kind of go from there. And everybody see my screen all right? If I can get some kind of okay that it's good. You're able to see the screen okay? Katie?
I cannot, no.
You can't see mine? Which screen are you seeing right now?
I'm just seeing you.
Okay. All right, how's that?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so navigating web soil survey. Again, my name is Mike England, Assistant State Soil Scientist for NRCS Wisconsin. I recently took on this position last February after spending more than 15 years on the soil survey side of things with NRCS. What is soil survey? So soil survey is this systematic examination description. You know, we can go through and talk about the different mapping schemas and how things were done across the continental United States. But it really, the basis of how our inventories were done is the reliability of the geomorphology and the soil forming factors. You know, these remote sensing techniques that are used to kind of give the basis on how we do the inventory. That consistency and accuracy and precision on how we document this kind of identifies those important soil characteristics that determine, you know, what that soil is. You know, we go back to Jenny and kind of, you know, bring in those foundational soil forming factors: climate, organisms, topography, parent material, and time. Now, how long ago were soil surveys? Well, in Wisconsin, it happened over 100 years ago when they did the first reconnaissance of parts of Wisconsin. Some of those focused on some of the national forests. Some of them focused on, you know, as a progression of European settlement. There's a variety of different vintages on how those were kind of created. Now, a more detailed description of how Wisconsin soil survey history is when the first map was published, and that was in 1882. That kind of resided into the federal soil survey where it kind of really began. So we already had a soil map, one of those, you know, it looked like a half sheet of paper, probably 15 pages, like they were folded in half. And that was kind of the first one that we had going on in the state. So from there, the Soil Erosion Service was formed under the DOI. We progressed from that kind of conceptual idea of an agency in that within that department and moved to the Soil Conservation Service once that actually fell under the USDA in 1935. Now, the majority of the workload in Wisconsin kind of continued through the 60s and actually all the way up almost to 2000, with the majority of the workload being done. So there were some older vintages that there were some remaps that were done for certain counties because of, you know, whether the description wasn't detailed enough or all that kind of, you know, that kind of information they kind of segmented to and kind of progressed and tried to get as updated detail before the entire state was done. They focused mainly on agriculture and those kind of lands versus an all-encompassing, you know, dealing with the majority of those forest lands up in the northern part of the state. So in 94, SCS went to NRCS, and in 2000, we had an agreement to finish all of the initial not documented soil mapping in Wisconsin. So from 2000 to 2005 was the majority of the workload, and many of you might know from the northwest part of the state is referred to as the Northwest 10. So it was 10 counties that were mainly forested, not much ag land. There was some farmland mapping, but the majority of that was left undocumented and uninventoried. So that big chunk was done in a 5-year period, and then Wisconsin became the 10th state in the United States to have a complete coverage of soil mapping. And you can find, if anybody ever wants a more detailed breakdown, and it actually, that book that's shown down on the bottom of the slide, that gives actually a lot of the names that assisted in those soil surveys. So they tried documenting who assisted, who did mapping in those areas. They tried getting acreage. So it's actually a really nice book. If anybody wants one of those, please reach out and we can send one to you. Now, talked about the progression and how that mapping was done. You can see this illustrated in the actual state map with the years that those surveys were completed, which those years might not match the published date of the book because there was such a lag in the processing. Like Jackson County, Wisconsin, kind of in the west central portion, it says 1994. Well, that manuscript actually wasn't published till 7 years later because of the push of the entire United States. The date of when they finished that soil survey and then the date when it actually became available to the public prior to the internet, you could tell how long of a lag there was to get this information out to people, to be able to share it with the general public and even within the agency. So this kind of shows a general progression, like I said, of Grant County being the first being done, and then that push kind of to the north and to the west as the final wrap up. Within Wisconsin, and I know a lot of you have experience of either working with NRCS or helping out with the surveys. There used to be a soil survey crew in each county, and as they got done with the county, they moved from county to county. This is the latest and greatest as of this spring for what they now call major land resource soil survey offices. So that major land resource area, you can see, are broken up into multiple segments that fall under a single area of responsibility. So in Wisconsin, we're actually supported by 5 soil survey offices and 12 MLRAs. So out of those 12 MLRAs that are touching parts of Wisconsin, they're serviced by 5 soil survey offices. Starting with Duluth, Minnesota, kind of covering that northwest portion, Rhinelander in north central Wisconsin, Juneau Soil Survey Office in the southeast, Aurora in the far southeast along the lakeshore, and then Onalaska Soil Survey Office in the west central portion, covering the driftless area and the central sands. So we go back to that ultimate question. I gave the kind of the correspondence on how the background and kind of the progression on how it's evolved. What is that soil survey? That is kind of the epitome of the question, and how useful that information is, and how do we disseminate it to use for practical applications? Well, the soil survey kind of gives you the partition of the landscape. It looks at, the major land resource areas. If we're talking about Wisconsin, the driftless area is much different landscape than the Green Bay lobe of the eastern side of Wisconsin, and much different than the other younger glaciations in the northern part of the state that fall within the Superior, Chippewa, and Langlade lobe. So all of those glaciations, each brought in material that have that different type of parent material, and that deals with a direct reflectance of what the vegetative patterns are. So slope, aspect, climatic patterns, all of these things, geology, especially in the driftless area. Once you change bedrocks, you're changing the soil series, you're changing how water movement is depending on the type of bedrock. You've got igneous, metamorphic, variations of different sedimentary of shale, sandstone, glauconitic sandstone, dolomite, limestone. There's all of these different types of nuances that directly affect what that soil is based on that parent material, and then inherently the vegetation. And a lot of this, like I mentioned, there were some inventories done in the 60s that were redone in the 90s. So there were a handful of them: Richland County, La Crosse County, Pepin County, Pierce County. Those were all actually signed by Congress to do a re-inventory because of the status of what they're in. A lot of you are accustomed to looking at a soil map and seeing, Anago silt loam, 2 to 6% slopes, moderately eroded, or some vintage of that. In those older surveys, they didn't get to that level of detail. Some of those because of the degree and the use of what they were that original intention for ag purposes, they would just use, Fayette gently sloping, or Fayette silt loam moderately sloping, or steeply sloping. They didn't have the degree of information that's needed for planning and for highly erodible land determination, that kind of information internally and externally. So that's why a lot of those were refined. So the state of Wisconsin has never gone coarser than an order 2. So when I talk about orders, that's kind of the level of intensity of how we kind of document what those soil surveys are. There are some areas in the United States that have an order 1, but the level of detail that's required, that's more focused typically on urban areas with high variability and a small distance from just, human disturbances and that kind of thing. Order 3, you'll find mainly out west, not necessarily California, but basically the Rocky Mountains and some of the BLM area in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. That's kind of where my level of expertise is with it. With the scale and usage of soil surveys, this kind of gives you an idea of how small of a polygon each of those areas have observed. So they gave a range from 1 to 12 to 1 to 31,640. When Wisconsin started off doing their soil survey, it was 1 to 20,000. That's the coarsest Wisconsin has ever documented their level, and that was back in the 50s with aerial photo interpretations. So as we progressed throughout the years, it kind of switched to 1 to 15,840 in that late 70s, early 80s time frame. It's not a complete clean cutoff based on where that county resided, because some went a little coarser, some didn't. And then it eventually migrated to the 1 to 12,000, which is the finest scale of order 2. So those soil boundaries, they really provide that remote sense data that we kind of need for interpretation. They provide those areas and that culmination of map units so that we can able to best use the land for that intensive purpose. We always try and push that soil survey is not a regulatory form of data. Its main purpose is for general land use planning. So that's why, with all of you that are on here today, your intensity work that you do at that local level, doing septics, doing any on-sites, doing wetland determinations, all of that information is much more refined than anything that the soil survey offices were able to provide for the public or for internal use. So post 2000, like I said, 1 to 12,000, and anything that's been going on through the continuous update project since the 2000s has been done at that finer scale. So we've always tried to refine. I spent about 12 years in the driftless area in Wisconsin Central Sands. We always try to do those projects more detailed than what it was previously. So a lot of the level of, delineations per acre has drastically increased throughout those counties in the driftless area, which covers 4 states, and the Central Sands, versus when it was originally inventory. And that was based on transecting specific projects that kind of modeled, water table monitoring, anything that would depth of bedrock, any of that kind of information. So all of the offices in the state have kind of gone through that same model through their area. They're not done by any means. I mean, it took 70 years to get the original inventory. So trying to piece together vintages of soil surveys 20, 30, 40 years apart, and they're sitting right next to each other, can be a challenge at times. It's never been a 1-to-1 correlation between soil survey areas. And so there's always that level of intensity that needs to be focused on getting a more detailed product and providing the best information. So again, this kind of just reiterates, the warnings that you would see on soil survey if you zoom in at a finer scale. So this warning is saying, this is the original intention of it. If you zoom in at 1 to 500, yep, you're going to see a lot of detail and a lot more information that probably wasn't originally recognized in the survey. But like anything, there's different parts of a soil survey. Most of us are familiar with the polygons that were delineated. Well, within a soil survey area, there's actually 3 different types of map units, and we'll get into those in a little bit. So here's just an example of saying you zoom in past the 1 to 12,000 in a place in Wisconsin, and here you go. You've got a wet spot that might be part of the map unit concept. It might not be. But there's also these other features you see to the left where that line feature. That's also another type of map unit. So we'll get into the different types of map units here with the next here shortly. So there's multiple products that we service. Most of you are familiar with the Sergo product that has that more detailed type of mapping schema in that list of properties that are available for interpretation. So we also provide what we call a StatsGo. That's more of the general land use. Those a lot of times really are focused in on those original ones from the early 1900 surveys and some refinement based off the modern mapping. So each of those surveys, when they were redocumented to a finer scale, the 1 to 20 to 1 to 12,000, they were also assigned basically a general soils association map. So that's kind of what StatsGo is. StatsGo is a continuous product for the entire state of Wisconsin and the US, showing those similar properties, but obviously not to the level of detail of what Sergo can for, more finite land use planning. Well, how are they made? Well, soil scientists, they observe pedons in the field. What are pedons? It's when you dig a hole. Those holes are just a form of documentation, inventorying what that soil is and how it reacts with the adjacent landscape. It's, many of us know that not every soil fits in that perfect little box, and that's why we have these variations. But we always have that main concept of saying the majority of it is this, and in that with delineated area, you'll have those variations. So being able to use remote sensing to repeat those soil patterns kind of alleviate you poking a million holes in one county. So it helped develop that product. And as you move through the survey, you had more confidence in how that concept model was kind of based on those soil forming factors. So we'll get into a little bit with the soil hierarchy. Pedons, those are those individual soil bodies that I just mentioned. Map units are that area defined and named in those same terms of their components. And now a component can be a series. A series is not necessarily a component. There could be variations that actually make that component classify to something else, even though it might use the same name. So you always want to be cognizant of soil taxonomy and also the phasing of what that component is within that map unit. The series is kind of like that stepping stone of the overall encompassing, conceptual idea and the range and characteristics of what that soil could be. It usually lists multiple landforms that it could be on, whereas those component levels, it's kind of like that next step of a more detailed information. Maybe that this Fayette soil is only on driftless ridge tops versus the Fayette that's in the Iowa erosional surface and some map in an MLRA in Iowa. Or maybe it's different than the Fayette valleys that are in river valley position versus the upland position. So there's a big importance on focusing on what those can be and how those areas disseminate each other. Now, the types of map units. So most of you are familiar with typically that single name, but for the majority of you that are in the Northwest, I'm sure you've seen a lot more complexes. And then there's actually areas that use undifferentiated groups. So that consociation is that single dominated component. The minimum amount is right around 70-75%. So you'll see some of the more historic ones that haven't been updated, they'll be populated at 100%. We know conceptually that doesn't always fit. There's always something variation within there, a bedrock depth, a water table depth, a paramaterial thickness change where it might kick to another series. So even in those older surveys, they might not list all of them right now because we haven't gotten to it yet. But if you revert back to the manuscripts, they will tell you, yes, there's 3 other named components typically within that map unit. Complexes, those are 2 or more dissimilar components. So you got Shawano, Briggsville. They can't be separated at the scale of mapping that they were inventoried, but they're both prominent enough that they need to be recognized as a major component within there. Now, even within complexes, there'll be other variations of minor components, usually maybe an up or down drainage, like I said, paramaterials, a water table depth different, whatever that might be. In Wisconsin, We have a couple of associations. It's not real common, but they are out there. And again, they can be differentiated. They just didn't do it. A lot of times that kind of reflected back on the aerial photo and not having, the more modern tools and technology that we have now with LiDAR and digital elevation models and hill shade and all that kind of stuff. They knew it was all out there, but it was too hard to delineate because of the vegetative canopy, or even sometimes in a crop field where some of these areas just they didn't take the time to split them out. They said it's repeating, it just can't be separated. In undifferentiated groups, that's the complete opposite of a complex. That's two or more contrasting where it's not repeated. A lot of these you'll see in Wisconsin mainly focus on organics or any of those really down drainage, wet alluvial areas. A lot of those focus on including basically those hydric components, the rim of a bog or something like that, and the very deep organic. So a lot of them will be, like a Tawas Lupton or Markey Sealyville undifferentiated group. They can either be listed as soils or actually with the same surface texture name. So the most important thing, and we'll get into this a little bit next, is being able to identify when you see these multiple name major components. There might be slight variations. They won't be as prominent of saying soils, association, or complex all the time. So we talk about these definitions. We defined what those components are. We identified on a map that there could be more than one type of map unit, or kinds of map units. That's the polygon, line, or point. Everybody's seen a wet spot or a stony spot, or like that line feature I showed you that usually indicated a short, steep slope. So that's actually a type of map unit. It's just not a polygon. So each of those line features or point features also have information on it, but most of the time end up being a miscellaneous component. Like I said, it could be a sinkhole, could be stony, could be a wet spot. And that's kind of just to make sure that the user is aware of that there are those anomalies that might not fit the actual concept of what that polygon is. So in order to have that, we need to make consistent patterns for a well-designed map unit. This includes all of the CLORP, or the soil forming factors, and should be able to be consistently delineated by a soil scientist. This decreases the number of observations needed when you have a strong and high confidence in your model. And then you also identify the occurrences for each of the component in the cantinas, as well as the anomalies that might not necessarily fit what that design is. So this is just another breakdown of typically how they kind of distinguish and those levels of details on where, in a consociation, these are kind of the limiting factors. So if you had a consociation with 15% rock outcrop, that would actually get kicked down to a complex. Even though it's only 15% or 10%, that's still enough in there because it's so drastically limiting versus what the typical soil is in that map unit, that it could still be part of that. So typically with those very contrasting soils, it has to be less than 10%. So if you're talking about a well-drained soil and you have 5% hydric minors, that's acceptable still as a consociation. Whereas if you had a well-drained soil and 15% hydric minors, well, now you're going to probably push that concept into a complex. So that was kind of the baseline on how they kind of designed, and they had to set a threshold on how they were going to document and inventory each of these map units with their properties. And again, this is just another list of how those soil components. So we talked about how those map units reside mainly of components and how those components usually reflect properties of series. Well, those components can actually fall in multiple categories. The soil series, like I mentioned, is typically the most common. That's kind of usually the most prevalent, the most normal use of what that soil is. So if anago, silt loam, 2 to 6% slope, within that map unit concept, you probably have anago, you probably have billy boy, you probably have sconson. There's multiple other variations of components that are within there, but in Wisconsin, the anago, and I think it's only mapped in Wisconsin now, is typically the only is typically the version that you're going to see as the majority of it. So now when we go into a little bit deeper, components that are given, a taxonomic reference. So it's basically saying, if anago is supposed to be fine silty or coarse loamy, we could have a variation that's fine silty. Well, that doesn't fit the conceptual, and maybe we don't have a series right now. So we'll put this in as a tax adjunct that within this map unit, there's also another version of anago, but it's more on the siltier end versus that coarse loamy. It's got more clay in it, it's got more silt, less sand, that kind of version. Miscellaneous areas, those are typically water, miscellaneous water, dunes, rock outcrop. Those are the kind of things that are, there's not really any soil information about it. It could be pits, could be gravel pits, that kind of stuff, dumps, that kind of stuff. So within that, usually when we document a tax adjunct, so like those taxonomic differences, we also rely on those phases of components. So typically when we also have a tax adjunct, we're going to try and put something in there saying this is a different phase. It has some variation. A phase doesn't necessarily mean a taxonomic difference, but a taxonomic difference definitely implies a phase, if that makes sense. So those are the different kinds of components that are used within a map unit. So we talked a little bit about component versus series, and the big thing that the big take home away from this is being able to recognize when you're talking about a component that you're looking, it's not always best to reference the official soil series description or the OSD, because you might have a variation of where that original OSD is located. So if you would look at the description down on the bottom or about in the middle of the OSD, you'll have a type location that says, hey, this is from Iowa. Well, when we use it in Wisconsin, it might be a variation. So always be cognizant, and it's always best to use those properties within Web Soil Survey for that specific map unit. So naming map units, as they went through and did the naming of map units, a consociation, again, going back to that hierarchy on what that percentage of major component is, usually that 75% threshold. And that consociation is actually still water. So water can be a consociation, plainfield sand, that's a consociation. You get into complexes where they're separated by a dash. These are examples of how I've seen some people misinterpret how a complex and an undifferentiated group are. They can have the same, if they have the same surface texture, the big difference is the complexes are separated by hyphens and undifferentiated groups are separated by the word and. Associations are also separated by hyphens, but they will always follow with the word association. So you know that those components, they're usually large in extent and they can be separated, which is different than a complex that can't be delineated at that scale. Phases. So this is where I was going back to, we talked about phases of components. Now we're going to talk about phasing of map units. So plainfield sand, 0 to 2% slope. That's the slope is actually a phase, because plainfield sand could be 2 to 6, could be 6 to 15, 6 to 12, 15 to 25. It could be 12 to 20, 20 to 30. There's all these variations, and also variations within that surface about what that component actually is. The Magner Freon complex, that has a rubbly version at the end of it. That rubbly that's tagged way at the very end of the map unit name isn't referencing a version of that component, but more of surface stoniness within that complex. Loxley peats, pediment, that's saying that, and this map unit actually resides in the Wisconsin Central Sands. So since Loxley came from up north in glaciated areas, we identified a Loxley in the Central Sands that actually falls with siliceous sand underneath. So we wanted to identify that these organics formed under the residuum from the sandstone escarpments and not from glacial outwash. So yes, Loxley is 2 meters of organic material, but the associated components that are tied with this Loxley peat are different than something that you would see up in Vilas County or something like that. Orion silt loam, again, we get into the slope, and then we also get into a flooding. There could be occasionally, rarely, or frequently flooded phases of what these map units are. So being particular to what those are and how those properties kind of coincide, kind of give you an idea of what the expectancy is of that map unit. Again, this one goes into a sole property. So we touched on surface stoniness, we touched on landform, we touched on flooding frequency, and now we're going to touch on a sole property. So Mucky peat, acid lake plain, that has multiple phases in here. You've got a slope phase, you've got a landscape phase, and now you also have a sole property phase. And people would say, well, Mucky acid, that would be docile. Well, Mucky's range of characteristics go so far. They go from 4.5 pH all the way up to 8. And what we wanted to do with this map unit concept is saying that it doesn't reach neutral. So there are some Muckies like in the Green Bay lobe or in the Langlade lobe or Chippewa lobe that kind of hover around that neutral correspondent. They don't typically go as far as 4.5. They could, but usually represented by Dawson. But in this instance, because of the transecting and the pH data collected, this one didn't approach neutral, but it also wasn't acid enough to be Dawson or docile for the silicious portion of the Wisconsin glacial lake plain. And then we get into phases of even water. So miscellaneous water. There could be sewage lagoon water. There's all these different types of phases that we don't want to recognize or lump into with riverine or lakes or any of that kind of stuff. So miscellaneous waters typically fall within those large manure storage pits, could be water treatment plants, could be areas in a gravel pit. These are different than what the typical water is that's being, run naturally through the landscape. So here's an example of Algancy-Kelmerville complex river valley, 0 to 3% slope, frequently flooded. There's a lot of information in there, and it's very complex map unit. This map unit resides through the driftless area, running from the St. Croix River all the way down to the Wapsie River in Iowa, and in 4 different states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. And it also runs along the Wisconsin River from the Devil's Lake, Baraboo Hills, the end of the Green Bay lobe, out to the Mississippi. So this actually came in a pretty repeating pattern. Some of you might not even be familiar with some of these, because a lot of this, when it was originally inventoried, was just listed as alluvial land. Well, alluvial land isn't an accepted miscellaneous component, and we needed to provide better information. So a good chunk of my workload throughout the years was updating alluvial land to be able to distinguish, give flooding frequencies, give soil properties, give parent materials, and kind of give a combination of what those map units kind of are. So within that Algancy component, this is typically what you see. This gives a breakdown of what those horizons are and kind of that representative color that they see within that component. Now, this is an instance where it doesn't necessarily match, but this time it does. So in this one, we were able to take, it actually follows the actual official soil series description. And this is what I was talking about, the type location here. This kind of gives you the nuance of, in the middle of that page of where that kind of came from. So this came from South Central Michigan over in the Lower Peninsula, and this series was also used. It's basically glacial outwash, not outwash, but alluvium that's been pushed down through major tributaries and deposited. Now, here's an instance we're dealing with Seton components and the vast difference of what these map unit concepts are. So we're going to look at 2 Seton map units, one a driftless valley 6 to 12 and a driftless ridge 6 to 12. And you're saying, well, they're both Seton, they should probably have fairly similar properties. Well, not necessarily. Both of these first horizon descriptions are typically what they found as representative or a TUD, those units that these units descriptions that they found in those soil survey areas. And those are different than what the TUDs are in the valley position. And those are different from what the official soil series descriptions. So I always push people away of just going into web soil survey, using some of the other digital soil projects from UC Davis on the soil web apps, and looking at what a more refined portion of what you're looking at. The Seton OSD is a great reference, but as you can see, its location is down in Henderson County, Illinois, which is west central, way outside the range of what it typically finds for its home. It was used, and with Wisconsin being between that mesic frigid portion of the state, we had some correlations that went on to try and keep that series kind of honed in within that mesic temperature regime versus the frigid. So this is just reiterating how vastly these compositions of these two map units can be as well. You deal with soils on the driftless valley dealing with sandstone minor components. You have glauconitic, which is the green, or the siliceous, which is the yellow. And in the Seton Ridge, you also deal with limestone and also with some sandy dolomite residuum that's in here, as well as the red clay. So you've got vastly different concepts that these Seton components are dealt with in their phases. So that's what the importance of recognizing and having those phases documented, so they're not confused with what the official soil series description is, and it gives better information to the customers on what the concept is. So this is just another example of plain field from the central part of the state. You've got an unphased composition of Meehan, Friendship, Richford versus the till plain in the Green Bay lobe of Plainfield, Richford, Okie. So you can see the difference. You've got some wetter portions in here that aren't necessarily recognized, and you've got till material that's creeping up in the portions of the map unit versus no till piece in the central lake plain. So just another comparison of showing how different those map units can be. This one is identified as just a Plainfield sand. This one is identified as a Plainfield sand till plain phase. Test of a good map unit. Does it capture the signature of the landscape? Is it recognizable, repeatable? Does it meet the objectives of the survey? Are we capturing what people need in order to do that? And if we're not, we need to hear from you so that we can get a better product out there. If you're seeing one anomaly, chances are it probably won't get fixed on a case-by-case business basis if it's not too dissimilar or too limiting or not limiting enough. But if you're seeing a repeating pattern in a map unit, please bring it to our attention. We'll dish it out to the soil survey offices, and they'll get a project in the long range plan to try and get it addressed if it's already not been acknowledged as an issue. So I know everybody's seen this as well. These are issues between soil survey areas. So you have areas that have different map units, different map unit symbols. You have areas of same map units with different map unit symbols. So there was no spatial change to change a symbol to make it look the same across political boundaries. And then you'll have different map units with the same symbols. That's probably the worst case scenario, where you would have like an AD in one county and an AD in another county, and one is alluvial land and the other one is Anago silt loam or something to that effect. So we have those issues all across there. We're progressing and making our way through those type of issues, and I'm in the process of creating a state legend to fix a lot of this stuff that can be fixed through just the first two examples of having different or the same map units but different symbols. So that'll take care of what this middle one is, and also this different map unit, same symbols. But the first one, that'll be done through the soil survey office to figure out what's more representative, where's the crossover, is there a landscape break that these can be separated on, and so forth. So this is just an example. This is down in, I believe this is Iowa County and Grant County. So you've got two different concepts, two different map unit compositions, similar components, but the major is very different. You've got a root restriction above 40 inches, whereas in Albaville, there is no root restriction. That's an MLRA project that's in the works. So they're going through and trying to finish that up to try and complete that. So this isn't an issue between there. You can see multiple other issues that are the same issue between this. All right, now we're dealing with the same name map units, but different symbols. You've got the same map unit, same exact composition, same exact national map unit symbol. This will tell you right here what is, if this is exact same. If this national map unit symbol is the same, then all this data is the same. But they haven't gone through and did the spatial recertification for this county yet. So I'm hoping to work on that this winter. There's gonna be a lot of spatial updates, and I know the progression on what the state wants, they want to revert to numbers. I know that's a pain, and I feel your heartache. I've really tried pushing for letters, but with a 2-letter combination like this down here in the CHA, there are not enough physical combinations. If you did every viable combination of these 2-digit letters, there's not enough in the state to cover all the map units. So I propose going to a 3-letter. Some of that was incorporated when I was still in Onalaska 3 years ago. I did some while I was in Rhinelander as a supervisor for the Soil Survey office, but the state wants to go to just this number convention with the C letter as being the slope, and then if there's a number being the erosion class, so 2 being moderately eroded. So as we progress, you'll end up seeing a 3 to 4 digit number, a slope class, and an erosion class if applicable. And then dealing with having the same map unit symbols and having different areas. So same map units, but with different symbols. This is between Marathon and Langlade County. This was a correlation that was done through a project. It was originally inventoried as Rochelle silt loam. And if anybody's from that area or the greater part of the Rochelle district, we all know that Rochelle doesn't come with a silt loam. That's actually Anago. So this was a correlation, but they didn't do the spatial recertification. So if you see this, the same national map unit symbols are exactly the same, this composition is the same, but the symbols are different, even though it's the same data, the same map unit. So again, we're going to go through and try and clean up some of this stuff, and hopefully within the next year or next October, you guys will see a vast difference in improvement on the political boundaries and the use of these between counties. And the last one is the different name map units with the same map unit symbols. So you've got Houghton in one county that happens to be a different Houghton map unit with different composition. Not too vastly different, but still, again, you can see the level of delineation. There was this being missed down in this area. This probably should have been drawn up in this county to connect that water body down here and also have that map unit within this county. So there's a lot of joint issues that need to be, again, addressed that will be focused on the Soil Survey offices, and we'll get those kind of prioritized to try and illustrate where those are located and try and just revitalize a lot of that information. And the same thing, you've got KMB2 with the different vintage of national map unit symbols, different composition, but again, adjacent right next to each other. So we know it's an issue, we feel, and we're trying to get these pushed through. It's just a lengthy process, and the rate at spatial certification, we're trying to improve on that process so we can have a better turnaround. How to address them. So reach out to us. Please, if you can, identify the map unit and what the specific issue is. Each office has this long working list. When I left Rhinelander, we had over 1,000 different projects in the hopper that needed to get addressed. When I was there, most of my staff, including myself, were tasked to help Minnesota with the initial soil survey in Pine County, as well as the Arrowhead. So that kind of really slowed progress for the northern part of the state. If you're within the agency, relay those issues to your supervisor, shoot it up the chain. Try and work with the area resource soil scientists. So there's 4 areas in Wisconsin. Each of them have but if you guys want to reach out to me or my supervisor, Jen Smith, the state soil scientist of Wisconsin, those are the ones we'll trickle that information down and get it to who it needs to so it gets worked on. And, I touched a little bit on how they're updated. Well, we prioritize from partners, customers, and agencies. There's been specific focuses on certain things when project types kind of jump to the head of the line because of needs, specific programming, particular issue in a county that needs, a water table project to help rectify some issues in land spreading or something like that. there's a whole list of these different type of projects that fall within specific map units. So you see this list here. Now you can just imagine if a half a dozen of those were different projects for each map unit. And a lot of these we try to address not just by map unit case, but as a katina within a much larger vasting project. That seems to get the most bang for the buck, and that's usually around a 2-year timeline as far as the turnover. So you might want to know where to access the soil survey data. We have a ton of web applications. This one, we're going to mainly focus today on web soil survey, but you have soil web apps that you can able to use. There's stuff for your phones with Apple operating systems and Android. You've got Series Extents to look at the Series database, Soil Data Mart, Google Web Earth. You can bring in a KMZ file if you are comfortable using that platform versus ArcMap. And there's, like I said, we're all migrating now from ArcMap to ArcPro, so there's that kind of carryover, but the main one that I would assume most of you use would probably be Web Soil Survey outside of like the mobile mapping or any of that kind of stuff. So how do you get started with it? Well, most of you probably already know that have used it. It's the big green button. If you type in Web Soil Survey in the search engine, it'll be the first one that pops up. How do you define your area of interest, that AOI? Well, there's multiple ways of doing it. If you want the whole county, then the next couple of steps are I'm going to be it's not that important. So if you download the whole county, that's where that second arrow is over here for download soils data, far right red arrow. But if you're looking for a specific area of interest and you want more detailed information, there are multiple ways of kind of circumventing how that soils data is encompassed. So if you're looking and you want to zoom into an area or look at different areas, this is the download soils data version where you get the whole county. You just basically go through, select the state, select the county, and then the area symbol, and you click download, and then it'll send an email to you for you to download it. And then you'll notice every year that these versions are updated around September and become official around October 1. So if you're not doing the whole county and you just want a small subset, there's, like I said, you could either do by the area of interest. You could do it by an address, by a state or county, soil survey area, lat and long, PLS, or you could just zoom in and kind of just use either one of these functions, either as a rectangle, or if you need to do something a little more creative in a different type of polygon area. So in this focus area, after you designated that AOI or area of interest, you click on the soil map tab it'd be the second one from the left. And this is what it'll bring up as an inventory. And if you scroll through down on the bottom of the page, it'll say the total amount of acres that you've selected. And it kind of gives you a % of the AOI breakdown of what that map unit includes. This is from Sauk County. So if you want more information from it, you just click on the blue area here where the map unit name is. When you click on that, a new window pops up and it shows you a soil map unit description. It gives the kind of composition, the typical profile, what you would see in inches, so you guys don't have to deal with centimeters if you don't want to. And it kind of gives a list of properties and qualities that show, where the water table, flooding, ponding, all that kind of information, land capability class. And then it also gives that same information for each of the minor components. So it started listing off with the first minor as Toddville. And as you scroll through here, it'll list each of the minors and give that same kind of information if it's populated in the database. So we're going to get into the part where everybody has a lot of fun searching for suitabilities and limitations. I know this is the biggest headache. This search option is available on top. So if you click this little down arrow, you can actually use that function and say if you're looking for depth of bedrock. If you type in depth of bedrock, it'll give you your search parameters and it'll show you how to get to it and navigate to it. For this one, we're looking for soil susceptibility for compaction. So using that same area, we're able to see the soil rating that it gives for this based on those soil properties of those for the map unit itself. Now, in this version, we're starting to give an assessment based on 3 ratings. And some of our interpretations, we're trying to recategorize those so it's not just those 4 ratings of not rated low, medium, and high. We're trying to have those intermediate portions between medium and high, medium and low. So in some of our interpretations, you'll able to see that kind of information. The same thing with organic matter. So if you open up the legend here on the side, this little tab, it'll list where those breakdowns and how they're categorized. So it might look really bad, everything being red, but those are map units that have a dominant condition that are saying, or a dominant component that are saying it has less than 4% organic matter, which is not uncommon in egg systems. And since those areas are looking at the surface here, like you can and if you wanted to put different depths in here, you're able to do. This one is just selected by the surface layer, but if you wanted to go deeper, and one thing that might not be prevalent is, these forested areas that have descriptions with those duff layers, you're thinking, well, man, those would easily fall in the green. When you select this surface layer, it omits those duff layers. It looks at the first organic or first mineral layer and not that thin duff layer. So we don't want to be misleading and showing some of those areas. That's why it's best to probably choose the top depth. If you only want 0 to 3, then you would get a different output based on that, with those surface layers having those duff layers. So we talked a little bit about the dominant component. Dominant condition, that's really not a major factor unless you're dealing with complexes or undifferentiated groups. Unless you're dealing with complexes and undifferentiated group. If you're dealing mainly with consociations, dominant component is fine. Dominant condition would only affect your rating if, say, you had 2 major components, one at 35 and one at 40 and one at 30, and your minor components still sided with that second major component. If you select dominant condition, it could override, but it might be more beneficial because that other dominant component might only be 40%, whereas 60% of the map unit might be more limiting or less limiting. So there's always that. Try more than one instance on those to try and get that information so that you have the most information available to make your determinations based on those map units. So, and again, we go through a lot of the soil data reports. So this last property, we went through the suitability and limitation examples, we went through soil property and quality examples. Now this is just a basic soil report that can be printed and have that for your use as needed. Some of these, one of the most common ones, again, on the conservation side, is using this engineering report. It gives a lot of what that unified class is, fragments, percent sieve, plasticity. It also gives, water table. I wasn't able to fit everything on here, but it's a good example on what those attributes could be for those map units and what it's typically found as. And again, this is just reverting back to the download soils data and how, if you want to include your own AOI, that's also a potential. Like if you're working in ArcMap or Google Earth Pro and you have a polygon, you can bring that information right in from ArcMap into Web Soil Survey, so you don't have to try and recreate it by drawing it again. Those areas are able to separate, and this data can be used in ArcMap, vice versa. If you want to download the soils data from that extent you drew, you can also bring it into ArcMap if you want to do more with Soil Data View or any of that type of interpretive maps. You've got these possibilities and all these map unit tables by joining these tables together. And again, we're here for assistance on this if you guys ever need help trying to get this functioning within your own personal computer. Or if you don't want to download it, the other portion is adding it to a cart. I know everybody, that's why we ended up having the word free put on here for the shopping cart, is making sure that everybody knows that this is not something that you pay for. And there's items here where you can select or deselect if there's something that you don't want from this report. So whatever you select, each interpretation or each soil property or each soil report, if you just click add to cart at the end of each of those versions, it'll throw everything into a mass document that'll show the area of interest that you have here, and it'll give a detailed information of how the soil surveys are made, kind of reiterating what I talked about today. Map unit description, a legend of where each of those are and any of those important reports that you might have, as well as the original soil map. Everybody's wondering, well, if I don't have those hard copies of soil surveys, where do I get them? Well, we want to make sure and stress the importance of that. The archive soil surveys are not official data. They were at the time of publication, but none of these are official data anymore. They might show a vintage of what that map unit could have been, but when we start bringing things together and making these map units cross political boundaries, there will be some map unit composition changes, maybe some correlations of map units. There's all that information. So in this page, if you type in archive soil surveys, it'll bring you to this web page. Or if you're having trouble with it, there's a spot right on the web soil survey page. So if you go in the bottom or about the middle of the page on the left-hand side, you click on that link for archive soil surveys, and that'll bring you to this web page. Once you're on this web page for the archive soil surveys, you scroll down to this green box here. And in that, you'll be able to click on a link that joins you to the box that we have and where all of them are stored. So in that link, it'll give you a list of all 50 states and any, I think Puerto Rico's in there as well. But you scroll down to the second to the bottom where Wisconsin usually is, and you click on this link right here. This link will bring you into this subfolder, this new window that'll list out all of the counties. Now, I want to give some instances on this where Barron had multiple vintages. So they had a 1958. They did a remap in 2001. So if you sort these by names, you'll be able to see, just click on the name right here and you'll see the ascending or descending order. And it'll give you the name and the year that it was published. Now, since Barron had more than one, they documented it this way. We don't have control over this. This is through national. Those areas, if you come over here, well, Barron's FIPS code is WI005. Well, you'll see if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, page 5 of 7, you'll see that WI005 is not listed here. That's because it has more than one vintage up here. So some of these that it could be kind of troublesome to try and find it. So I want to give you guys exposure that it could be in more than one place. If you don't find it in the original alphabet on how they're sorted by county name, scroll down to where the county FIPS is being used. And that's typically around page 5 of 7. So that will also start over. Not all of them are that way. Adams County is, and Ashland County is, but Barron isn't. You know, Bayfield is listed over here, but it's also listed over here because it was part of the Northwest 10. It wasn't done by its own inventory. So there's all these vintages on what's going on. And with that, this kind of concludes my talk on web soil survey and kind of the background and everything of map units and components. And I want to leave you with this. This is actually from a 1990 publication for when Kalkaska was the Michigan state soil. This made the official publication of SSSA. Of one page had it in situ, and the next page had it as you see here. So take everything with a grain of salt, look at the bigger picture and perspective. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to come off mute and ask. I'm available for as long as you guys need me.